Imagine you're in a fighter jet above Greece on a bright summer morning. Up ahead, a Boeing 737 is flying perfectly straight, perfectly level, exactly where it's supposed to be in the sky. But something is very wrong. You pull alongside the cockpit, expecting to see two pilots at the controls. Instead, you see one seat empty, the other slumped over, motionless. And behind them, dozens of oxygen masks hanging from the ceiling like pale, lifeless vines. The airliner keeps flying anyway. No radio calls, no response, no sign that anyone is truly in control. For more than an hour, this jet will circle the skies above Athens, guided only by autopilot and momentum, while everyone on board slowly slips beyond the point of no return. This is the real story behind the so-called ghost plane, Helios Airways, Flight 522, the flight that looked, from the outside, like a normal passenger jet lining up for another safe landing, even though inside the cockpit nobody was truly there. On August 14th, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 was supposed to be nothing more than a routine holiday hop. A Boeing 737-300 tail number 5, BDBY, would leave Larnaca in Cyprus, make a quick stopover in Athens, then continue on to Prague with 115 passengers and 6 crew on board. The airplane's name was Olympia, and that morning it was full of families, couples, and tourists escaping the August heat for a European vacation. Flight 522 takes off from Larnaca just after 9 a.m. local time, climbing out over the Mediterranean and heading northwest toward Greece. Early radio calls with air traffic control are routine. Nothing in the voice of the captain or the first officer sounds stressed or unusual. Then, shortly after departure, something happens that no one in the cabin can see. At 12,000 feet, a horn sounds in the cockpit, a loud, urgent tone, and the pilots report what they think is an air conditioning problem. They talk with the airline's operations center on the ground, discuss equipment cooling lights and circuit breakers, and try to track down what they believe is a relatively minor issue. But the warning they're hearing is not about air conditioning, and it is not minor. It's the cabin altitude warning. The sound that means the air in the cabin is thinning, the pressure is dropping, and everyone on board is starting to run out of oxygen. As the minutes tick by, the plane keeps climbing, the autopilot doing exactly what it's told to do, while the people responsible for it slowly lose the ability to think clearly. By 9:20 a.m., Flight 522 has climbed through 28,000 feet. That's the moment when radio contact with the crew simply stops. Cyprus controllers try to reach them again and again. Nothing, no response. The jet keeps going, leveling off at 34,000 feet, cruising altitude, and it flies straight toward Athens. When it crosses from Cypriot airspace into the Athens Flight Information Region, Greek controllers also try to hail the plane. They call on different frequencies. They ask other aircraft nearby to relay messages. Still nothing. From the ground, Flight 522 looks perfectly normal on radar, at exactly where it should be at that time. But it behaves like an empty airplane, a machine going through the motions of a normal flight with nobody answering the phone. As the ghostly 737 approaches Athens, the autopilot does what it's programmed to do. It guides the jet into the holding pattern for the airport, circling over the KEA VOR, a navigation beacon southeast of the city. At 34,000 feet, Flight 522 enters the pattern and just stays there. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour. Athens controllers call 19 times between about 10:12 and 10:50 at a.m., but the radio stays silent. From below, if you know where to look, you can see a bright white jet tracing wide, lazy circles in the sky, like a clock hand that never moves forward. Inside that jet, though, the cabin looks very different. At around 18,000 feet on the climb, the passenger oxygen masks would have deployed automatically, dropping from the ceiling as the system tried to protect everyone from the thin air. People would have felt their ears hurting, their heads pounding, maybe a strange euphoria or confusion as hypoxia took hold. Then, one by one, most of them would have slipped into unconsciousness. The only people on board with access to longer-lasting oxygen were the cabin crew, and they would need to understand what was happening quickly in a cabin full of frightened passengers. Meanwhile, on the ground, the situation is escalating. A jet that should have started descending toward Athens has instead been circling aimlessly for far too long. There's no hijack code on the transponder, but there's also no voice coming from the cockpit. In the post-9/11 world, that combination is terrifying. By 10:54 a.m., the Greek authorities classify Flight 522 as a possible renegade aircraft, a threat that might need to be intercepted, or in the worst case, shot down. At 11:05 a.m., two F-16 fighters from the Hellenic Air Force roar into the sky from Nea Anchialos Air Base. Their job is simple on paper and impossible in reality. Get alongside that 737, find out what's going on, and be ready, if ordered, to stop it from becoming a weapon over a major European capital. For almost 20 minutes, the fighters close the distance. When they finally pull up on either side of Flight 522, they see something they've never seen before. The passenger cabin is full of hanging oxygen masks. Some seats look occupied, but no one seems to be moving. It's like looking into a frozen moment, a plane full of mannequins, except these are real people caught in a disaster they never understood. The F-16 leader swings closer to the cockpit windows. The first officer is slumped over his controls, head down, unmoving. The captain's seat is empty. No one is looking back at the fighters. No one is clearly in charge. The radio remains dead. For a moment, the pilots consider the nightmare scenario everyone's afraid of, that this is a hijacked aircraft, its crew murdered, its passengers incapacitated, and someone unseen in the back waiting to dive it into a target. But there are no signs of movement. No threatening gestures, no sudden changes in heading, just the steady robotic grace of the autopilot, dragging the jet through its holding pattern again and again, the engines humming along as if nothing is wrong. Imagine being one of those fighter pilots, watching a fully loaded passenger jet drifting in endless circles and realizing that the people inside may already be beyond help, while the plane itself is still doing exactly what it's been told to do. Then, just before noon, something happens that will haunt everyone who studied this case. At about 11:49 a.m., almost 3 hours after takeoff, one of the F-16 pilots sees movement in the cockpit. A figure steps into view and sits down in the captain's seat. It's not one of the original pilots. It's a flight attendant, 25-year-old Andreas Prodromou, who also happens to hold a commercial pilot's license from the UK, even though he isn't rated to fly a Boeing 737. While almost everyone else on board has long since lost consciousness, Andreas has stayed alive by using a portable oxygen bottle. Somewhere in that hypoxic, chaotic cabin, he has realized that no one in the cockpit is responding, and he has taken the most terrifying walk of his life, forward past rows of slumped passengers and dangling masks into a cockpit where his own colleagues lie motionless. He sits down, puts on a headset, and tries to take control of a jet that has been flying itself for hours. From the fighter jet, the Greek pilot later describes seeing him wave, just briefly, as if to say, "I'm here, I'm trying." Inside the cabin, the oxygen bottles are running low. The engines are running low too, not on air but on fuel. At 11:49 and 50 seconds, the left engine flames out. The 737 leaves its neat holding pattern and begins to drift off course, no longer held perfectly in place by its autopilot. 10 minutes later, the right engine also dies of fuel starvation. The cockpit voice recorder captures a handful of faint, desperate mayday calls, almost certainly from Andreas, but the radio is still tuned to the wrong frequency. Larnaca instead of Athens, and nobody hears him in time. With both engines out, the ghost plane is no longer a steady circling presence in the sky. It's a silent, gliding airliner dropping toward the hills near the village of Grammatico, about 40 kilometers from Athens. In those final minutes, investigators believe Andreas manages one last act. He banks the aircraft slightly away from the dense urban sprawl of Athens and toward a rural area, ensuring that whatever happens next, the only victims will be the people already on board. At 12:03 p.m., Helios Airways, Flight 522 hits the hillside and breaks apart, killing all 121 people on board in what would become the deadliest aviation accident in Greek history. On paper, this is where the story ends. A jet leaves Cyprus, flies itself in circles over Athens, and eventually runs out of fuel, becoming a symbol of everything we fear about aircraft that seem to fly with no one in control. But for investigators and for the families of the people on board, the crash site is not the end. It's the starting point for a much harder question. How does a modern airliner, flown by trained professionals, turn into a ghost plane in less than an hour, all because of a single switch on a pressurization panel and a warning horn that sounded like the wrong emergency? When investigators reached the wreckage of Flight 522 near Grammatico, they weren't just looking for bodies or black boxes. They were hunting for the one small thing that could turn a healthy airplane into a flying tomb. Buried in the twisted metal, they found the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. And they also found something else, the position of a single control on the pressurization panel. On a Boeing 737, cabin pressurization is normally set to auto. In that mode, as the aircraft climbs, the system quietly feeds more air into the cabin and keeps everyone breathing comfortably while the outside air thins out. On Helios Flight 522, that switch wasn't on auto. It was on manual. Even worse, the outflow valve, the trapdoor that lets air leak out of the cabin, had been left partly open. That meant the airplane was climbing into the sky with no automatic pressurization and a cabin slowly losing air, like a balloon with a pinhole. The recorders showed that during the climb, the cabin altitude warning horn sounded at about 12,000 feet, exactly as it was designed to do, and yet nobody put on an oxygen mask, nobody leveled off and descended, and nobody correctly understood what that horn was trying to say. So investigators asked the obvious, brutal question. How does an experienced crew miss a warning that, on paper, should be almost impossible to ignore? To answer that, they had to rewind to the night before the crash. Helios' 737 had come in with a complaint about a frozen door seal and strange noises from the rear of the cabin. Maintenance crews ran tests on the pressurization system, switching the mode selector to manual so they could drive the outflow valve directly. When they finished the checks, they simply didn't put the switch back to AUTO. On its own, that's a serious mistake, but not automatically a death sentence. The next morning, 3 separate cockpit checks should have caught it. The pre-flight check, the after-start check, and the after-takeoff check. Each of those checklists includes the pressurization panel. Each one is a chance to look up, see the selector in manual, notice the green manual light, and think, wait, why is that there? On Flight 522, all 3 chances were missed. The official report later noted that both pilots overlooked the pressurization system state on 3 occasions. They were used to seeing that panel in the correct position, so their brains filled in the gap and told them everything was normal, even when the switch and that glowing indicator were quietly shouting the opposite. This is the point where the story stops feeling like a freak mechanical accident and starts feeling uncomfortably human. When we see the same thing over and over, our brains stop really checking it. We see what we expect to see. In this cockpit, that tiny blind spot ended up costing 121 lives. Even with the switch in the wrong position, even with those checks missed, there was still one more safety net, the cabin altitude warning horn. At just over 12,000 feet, the horn came on, loud, piercing, designed to be impossible to ignore. But on this particular model of the 737, that exact same sound was also used for something completely different, the takeoff configuration warning, which normally goes off on the ground when you try to take off with flaps or trim set incorrectly. Same horn, 2 very different emergencies. Investigators concluded that the crew of Flight 522 almost certainly misread the situation and treated the horn as a stray takeoff configuration warning that had somehow activated in the climb. On the cockpit voice recording, you can hear them talking about air conditioning and an equipment cooling problem. The captain even calls maintenance on the ground to ask why they're hearing this noise. While they're troubleshooting a problem that doesn't exist, the real emergency, lack of oxygen, is quietly getting worse. Here's the cruel detail. The checklist for a cabin altitude warning and the checklist for a takeoff configuration warning are completely different. One says, masks on, start a descent immediately. The other says, check your flaps and trim settings. If you pick the wrong one, you've effectively stepped into the wrong universe. The investigation found that the pilots failed to recognize the loss of pressurization and never initiated the cabin altitude warning or rapid depressurization checklist. Instead, they burned precious minutes hunting for an imaginary air conditioning fault while hypoxia slowly took over their minds. Within roughly 15 to 18 minutes of that horn sounding, their ability to think clearly, to cross-check instruments, to ask simple questions like, "Are we pressurized?" would have been fading. Soon after, they would have been unconscious, still strapped into their seats, still surrounded by working instruments, and yet completely unable to use them. The ghost plane wasn't caused by a single dramatic explosion or a wing tearing off. It was caused by the wrong mental file being opened at the exact wrong time. One of the most heartbreaking parts of the official report is the list of missed chances. All the small moments when this disaster could still have been stopped. First, the ground crew who left the pressurization in manual could have been working under a stricter procedure. A written, mandatory step to return the selector to auto after testing, or a second technician required to verify the panel before signing off the aircraft. Then there were the cockpit checks. 3 separate opportunities for the pilots to notice that the switch was wrong, that the indicator light was on, and that the cabin altitude needle was climbing towards danger. Then there was the horn itself. If they had recognized it for what it really was, a pressurization warning, not a takeoff warning, the drill would have been simple. Masks on, autopilot on, turn around, descend. Other crews, with the same horn and the same airplane, had successfully done exactly that in earlier incidents. There were also the passengers and cabin crew. A later forensic report showed that many of the victims were still technically alive at the moment of impact, but locked in a deep, unrecoverable coma from prolonged lack of oxygen. They never woke up enough to understand what was happening to them. The cabin crew had more oxygen available through portable bottles, and at least 2 of them, including Andreas Prodromou, managed to stay conscious far longer than anyone else. They were the only ones who could have been the eyes and ears telling the cockpit, "Something is very wrong back here. Masks are down. People are passing out." But communication between cabin and cockpit broke down almost as soon as hypoxia started to bite. By the time Andreas fought his way forward, sat in the captain's seat, and tried to take control, the disaster was already in its final act. Every layer of the safety system and maintenance checklists, warning design, crew training, company oversight had small weaknesses. And on August 14th, 2005, all of those weaknesses lined up. The final report didn't just blame the pilots. It described a whole chain of causes. The pressurization mode selector had been left on manual after maintenance. The flight crew failed to spot that on 3 separate checks. They misread the warning horn. They never used the correct checklist or put their oxygen masks on in time. And on top of that, investigators pointed to broader organizational problems at Helios Airways, from training and supervision to overall safety culture. Regulators in Europe and the United States took the case seriously. The FAA and other authorities issued directives to clearly distinguish the cabin altitude warning from the takeoff configuration warning on 737s, so future crews wouldn't be listening to a single ambiguous horn and trying to guess which life or death scenario they were in. Airlines were told to reinforce training on hypoxia, on recognizing subtle cabin pressure problems, and on the importance of putting masks on first and asking questions later. In simulators and classrooms, Helios 522 quickly became the textbook example of how fast a crew can lose the ability to think, and how for a few eerie minutes they can still sound almost normal on the radio while it happens. On the legal side, the fallout was messy and painful. Helios Airways eventually shut down, briefly rebranding as a jet before disappearing entirely. Several senior executives and a British engineer were charged with manslaughter and causing death by negligence. In 2011, a Greek court convicted 4 of them and handed down long prison sentences, though later appeals and legal battles would reduce or modify parts of those convictions. Families of the victims also pursued civil cases, including suits against Boeing over the design and labeling of the pressurization controls and warning systems, arguing that a single horn should never be allowed to represent 2 completely different emergencies. In the end, no court ruling could change the core truth written into the final report. Helios Flight 522 was not the work of one villain or one mistake. It was the product of a system that allowed small problems to stack up until nothing could stop them. Today, if you sit in a modern 737, some of the safety features around you exist because of what happened on that August morning. Pilots are now trained again and again to treat the cabin altitude warning as pressurization first and everything else second. Masks on, descend, then troubleshoot later. Many airlines require regular hypoxia awareness training, sometimes in altitude chambers where crews can safely experience and remember what it feels like when your brain quietly starts to shut down from lack of oxygen. Checklists have been tightened, maintenance procedures for pressurization systems have been made clearer and more explicit. Oversight of smaller, low-cost carriers in Europe has become stricter, partly because Helios exposed how vulnerable a company can be when cost-cutting and tight schedules eat away at safety margins. And yet the story still hits a nerve for a simple reason. From the outside, Flight 522 looked fine. There was no dramatic mid-air breakup, no towering storm cell, no hijackers. For more than 2 hours, this jet followed its flight plan, flew its holding pattern, and obeyed every line of code in its autopilot, while almost everyone inside was already gone. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question about modern life. How many systems around us are quietly running on autopilot, looking normal on the surface, while some small, unnoticed switch deep inside is waiting to fail? In the official dramatizations and in the pilot's own testimony, one moment keeps coming back. An F-16 pilot, drawing level with the 737's nose, looks into the cockpit and sees Andreas Prodromou in the left seat, fighting an airplane that's slipping away from him, waving once through the glass like a man on the far side of an aquarium. Moments later, one engine fails, then the other, and the ghost plane begins its final descent, not toward a city full of millions of people, but toward a hillside, where it will only claim the lives already on board. The official report talks about hypoxia, maintenance procedures, checklist discipline, and human factors. But between those lines is the quieter story of a young flight attendant who stayed conscious long enough to try to steer a doomed jet away from the worst possible outcome. Helios Airways Flight 522 is remembered as the plane that flew with no pilots on board, a ghost in the sky, guided only by automation and inertia. Yet if you look closely at those last minutes, you can still see one human hand on the controls, trying to make sure the disaster ended with the people who were already lost. If this story kept you in your seat, let me know in the comments which part hit you hardest. The missed switch, the warning horn, or that final hopeless attempt to save the flight. If you want more deep dives into real aviation mysteries, subscribe for more stories from inside the cockpit and tell me which incident you want to see next. Not all ghost stories happen on the ground.